Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, this week's guest is another guest who multiple listeners wrote in and suggested that we have on the podcast. Dr. Robert Forrant is a distinguished university professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he teaches courses on global labor issues, labor history, immigration, and international development. He also serves as the director of the department's graduate program. He has been a consultant to a number of organizations, including the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the International Labor Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Dr. Forrant received the University of Massachusetts President's Award for Public Service in 1998. And in a topic that caught the attention of a whole lot of Franco-Americans, Dr. Forrant was behind a great new project in Lowell that a whole bunch of people were talking about and that we will be talking about on this podcast. Dr. Forrant, welcome to the French Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Pleasure. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So before we get going too much into the Franco-American story and the Lowell story, maybe I get a little bit about your background, if that works. Maybe tell us kind of where you're from, how you got an interest in labor history, international labor.
So I grew up in Beverly, Massachusetts, big Catholic, Irish, French, Canadian, Italian.
Oh, wow.
Ancestry. So
that seems like a
big
like a
Catholic from all three different parts of the world family.
And they didn't fight amongst each other? No?
No, not that. I don't remember. So
Gotcha.
So it couldn't have been too bad. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I went to Northeastern University in Boston back when it was $400 a semester.
Wow, I'll take that.
So that's how old I am. I just gave away my age. And I finished my degree. I got a degree in history. I always loved history. Northeastern I went to because it was co-op and
Sure.
You took semesters on, semesters off. You could make money. And I actually ended up with very little debt at the end of my time there because they had really good jobs, made money. And
That's awesome.
I had an apartment in Boston with a couple of other friends, and life was good. I got a master's degree at Northeastern a couple of years later. And then a little while after that, I ended up going out to UMass Amherst to get my PhD in history. While I was working on my PhD, I had a house fire.
Oh, wow.
And I lost all my research. And
Oh,
this is
geez.
before you could have like zip drives and thumb drives,
Sure.
whatever, the cloud and all the other stuff that you can have to save things. So I lost all the work that I had done up
Oh,
to that
wow.
point on what was my final work, my doctoral dissertation. And so I quit school. And I went to work. So this is the long and short of why labor history.
Yeah, no,
so
this
I ended
is
up working for nearly 15 years as a machinist in a really big factory in Springfield, Mass. Worked there for quite a while, then became the business agent for the union, International Union of Electrical Workers, Local 206, and I did that for about 4 years, and then very abruptly the company pulled out of Springfield and closed. So I ran a community economic development project in Springfield for about 3 years, trying to help out-of-work machinists like myself find different kinds of jobs and
Sure.
training to find something new to do, because that part of Massachusetts was losing industrial jobs, really staggering numbers. I had always stayed in touch with my main advisor at UMass Amherst. And he kept telling me to come back to school and finish. He kept saying, you'd be a good teacher, so you should come back to Lowell and finish. I didn't come back to Amherst, and
Sure.
finish. I didn't think that much of it initially, but once the Bosch closed, American Bosch, the place I worked in, once it closed, I thought more about it, and eventually I went back. And he helped me so that I didn't have to take courses again. I had about a 15-year gap from the time I started the program till I quit, till I went back and finished.
Sure.
But we worked it out so they didn't have to take courses all over again. And I did different research entirely from what I had been working on at the time of the fire. And I finished in the summer of 1994, and within a few weeks after that, I got a job offer from from UMass Lowell to teach in a graduate program that they had then, as well as in the history department. And so I did that I had a 1-year contract. I had a couple of 1-year contracts. Then they offered me a full-time job. I had 2 kids at the time. I didn't necessarily want to relocate them. One was in starting high school, one was in middle school.
Sure.
So I drove back and forth from Holyoke, where I lived.
Oh, wow. That's not a short drive.
Canadian population out there.
Yeah.
Drove back and forth from Holyoke to Lowell on the days that I taught, and then back again in the evenings. And then eventually they went off to college, and I thought, okay, well, I either need to get a job in Western Mass or I need to move to Lowell. And so that's what I did. I moved to Lowell several years ago. So I live in Lowell. I live in the Centerville neighborhood in Lowell. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Now, I'm curious, what was the initial topic then?
So my initial topic was sort of the Italian side of my family. In Beverly, Massachusetts, in the early 20th century, there had been a mass influx of Italians to Beverly, Lynn, Salem, that area, largely because they were building a lot of stone factories, not red brick, but almost like quarried granite and such, and a lot of like really skilled brickwork. And there were a lot of Italian masons apparently at the time in Italy without any work to do. And so they were recruited to come specifically to Beverly to build this really gigantic factory building, which is still standing today. It was the United Shoe Machinery Corporation. When it was built, it was the largest producer of machinery to make shoes in the entire world. And so they built this massive multi-floored, several block long building, and then they stayed. And so at the time, I had enough reading skill and a little bit of fluency in Italian that I was researching and writing about how they ended up in Beverly and sort of the history of the Italian community in Beverly. But after losing all that work, I sort of lost touch with the language and whatever. And so the idea of going back and doing that again just wasn't feasible.
Gotcha.
So I ended up writing, again, sort of what I knew. I wrote about the history of the Connecticut River Valley and the collapse of industry from like Hartford, Connecticut, all the way up into Springfield, Vermont. The region along the river, which had been this incredible industrial region from the mid 19th century till the 1980s. And so I wrote about the history of the sort of the rise and fall of that industrial complex. And then I turned that into a book.
That's awesome.
And so it was very different topic, but always, I mean, for me, always industrial history, working class history of the US, which is sort of my field, always was immigration history too. You couldn't do working class history.
Sure.
You couldn't do industrial history without thinking about immigrants and immigration, because immigrants were the backbone of the blue collar workforce in the history of the country. So I've always been sort of a foot in each camp, if you will, in terms of if I'm writing about Lowell labor history, I'm writing about French Canadian workers, Greek workers, Portuguese workers, Irish workers in the early 19th century. And so there's always a crossover. So I really see the way that I've sort of evolved into writing a lot of immigration related history just sort of is a natural sort of connection to everything else I do.
No, that's great. And what made you decide, I'm going to take some time to tell the Franco-American story here in Lowell?
Well, part of it was several years ago, myself and a colleague, Christoph Strobel, who's in the history department at UMass Lowell, we were fortunate enough to get a grant from the Lowell National Park to write an immigration history of the city. Not like incredibly detailed the way an academic book would look, but sort of an overview history of immigration in Lowell. And in the process, so this was 2004, 2005, maybe, that period of time. We wrote a lot about sort of the waves of immigration coming into not just Lowell, but Haverhill, Lawrence, sort of Nashua, sort of, every sort of in the greater Lowell area, I guess you could say. And one of the large groups was French Canadians. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of French Canadians that slowly came down over the last part of the 19th century. And so writing about that community, it was when I first became aware, and this is sort of how all this dovetails, first became aware that the largest concentration of French Canadian first and second generation as they settled in Lowell and then had kids and settled still further was in an area of the city that's now populated largely by UMass Lowell. Most of the university's dormitories, its recreation center, the Lasher Park, the baseball field where the Lowell Spinners play, that whole area was the French Canadian neighborhood. And as we were doing the research, I came to figure out and find out that that whole neighborhood, that whole area was torn down by the city. Before the university was there, the university didn't have anything to do with knocking it down.
Sure.
The city decided to knock the neighborhood down, and I got fascinated by and interested in what that looked like and how that impacted people that had grown up there generationally, that had really rich culture in that neighborhood, a couple hundred stores, newspapers, churches, daycare centers, St. Joseph's Hospital, which was largely French-speaking physicians and nurses that tended to people in the neighborhood. And it just struck me as this really interesting research. And so I started researching and writing about that. And then I thought, well, it's really fascinating that this history is there and all these students and the university are all congregated in this space, but there's virtually nothing that indicates to the students that are living there now who was there before.
Sure.
There's absolutely no record in any sort of physical way. And so when I was teaching, I would tell my students and they would go, wow, how come like we don't know that? How come that's not
right.
like? And so slowly but surely, I kept hectoring the university and saying, we need to do something. We need to put some signage up. We need to do something about this history and make it more visible for all the thousands of students that come and go in that neighborhood every day, that walk over the bridge over to the campus, but leave their dorms and whatever, and as well visitors who come to the
sure.
university, parents, grandparents, whomever, are walking in that area, and where the Lasher Park is, where people come to watch baseball games. And so that's essentially how sort of the idea came into being, to try to get. And for me, one of the things I like to do with my students is get them involved in, if I can figure out a project like that and get some money to help fund students to help me do the work.
Of
I
course.
love getting students involved and helping do the research and sort of doing the initial writing, and I'm working with them, but I want them to do something with if they're studying history, but I want them to also figure out what it means to be a historian, what it means to find stuff out and write about it and display it to the public, to the general public as well, not just in an academic setting. And so I'm always looking for ways that I can cross over with what I'm researching and writing myself. And so this project became something that over the period of time, several students worked on too.
Now, before we get into the specifics about the project, which we definitely will, maybe just a little bit of background, because we've talked about Lowell before, but not a ton on the podcast so far. When did the French Canadians arrive? Why did they arrive? Where did they come from?
Basically, the records, the census records and other things that we've looked at to try to understand this better, there's a small number of French Canadians in the Lowell area, in the Merrimack River Valley area, around the early 1860s, around the time of the Civil War, but not really significant numbers. But between 1865, 1870, and 1900, somewhere between 600 and 700,000 French Canadians come down into Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts.
Wow. Yeah.
And then amongst that population, several thousand, again, depending on what you're looking at, somewhere between 35 and 40,000 people eventually, French-speaking people eventually end up in Lowell proper.
Wow.
And so it's interesting, the history and a lot of oral histories that have been collected where families talk about the process. In many cases, it's what historians call serial migrations. People will come down from the Maritimes or from Quebec or some other parts of Canada. They might come into Maine for a little while and then
Sure.
go back. Next time they might come into northern New Hampshire and then go back, and then they come into southern New Hampshire and then eventually into Mass. And it's different than European migration, because European migration, the trip, not to say that a trip from Quebec to Lowell isn't arduous, but you're not in a sailing ship or a steamship on
Sure.
the
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
and it's a bit easier to go back. And so for the longest time, like in this period from 1870 to 1900, 1910, people are going back and forth. So they're coming down in like late fall, when if they have farms or they're doing lumbering or fishing or whatever, the weather now is prohibitive. So they can come down into southern Nashua or someplace like that, or Manchester, New Hampshire, or Lowell, and work in the mills, or Lawrence, or even like out toward Holyoke Way to work eventually in paper mills. But then in spring, they might go back. So they might
Sure.
work for 5 or 6 months and then go back and then come back again and go back and come back again. And so there's a lot of this, what's pretty episodic and a bit different. Again, a lot of people, if they're coming from on the other side of my family, for example, from southern Italy, when they got here, they got here.
You're not going back for spring, right?
Going back, and you weren't gonna. Maybe you would work here for a while and then go back, like make money and then go back and buy a farm or
Sure.
a winery or whatever. That was that, right? For the majority of people.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
and then once the railroad is in, it's even easier for people to move back and forth.
And I'm assuming they were all recruited by mill recruiters. Is that essentially how
Yeah, in
this
some
happened?
cases they were. In some cases they would be recruited, but then once people got here, word of mouth, and so everybody
sure.
that came to Lowell wouldn't leave, right? And so there would starting in the 1870s, there was a stable number of people who were here, and so then what would happen is it would be sort of extended families.
Gotcha.
Right. So if you were in a large French Canadian family and you settled in, say, Nashua or New Hampshire or Manchester, New Hampshire, and you now were in a triple decker or whatever, 3 family, and working in one of the mills there, the Amoscog mill or whatever you were doing, you would write back home and say there's plenty of work.
Right.
And then maybe your brother or your cousin or somebody would come down, and then eventually, if they were making money, if they were married, they might have their wife and their small children come down with them, and eventually that's sort of how the community spread. So definitely recruitment,
Sure.
for sure, but also word of mouth. Railroads would recruit because railroads like selling tickets.
Of course.
Also during this period of time, there were no there was no immigration laws and rules the way we think about them today. You didn't have to get a visa. Right, we don't really do that
Right.
Until well into the 20th century, after World War I. So it's not as difficult as it would be today. I mean, it's even more difficult, obviously, now with COVID.
Right. Yeah.
But COVID aside, it would, if you wanted to migrate and live permanently in the U.S. from Canada, you would have to get a visa. You would have to do all of the paperwork, and you'd have to get some kind of a green card or whatever to be able to work and such. That didn't exist.
Gotcha.
So it was so the border, while there's obviously a border, it's not policed in the same way we think of it now. We don't have passports the way we have them today. Passports are really not used all that much until World War II. And so people can move back and forth pretty easily.
Gotcha. And maybe you could paint a picture for us, because I live in Manchester, New Hampshire. Where I'm coming to you now is actually a living room from a place that was converted mill housing, in fact.
Okay, well, there you go. So you've got the echoes around you.
I do, absolutely. But I understand that there was a Petit Canada area of Lowell. Maybe you could paint the picture, what the schools look like, what the churches look like,
Sure.
What kind of media, newspaper, radio, any of that stuff.
Yeah, so there's a pretty sizable culture. There are several newspapers. Le Echo Canada is one paper. There's something called the Journal du Commerce, L'Etoile. There's like a whole bunch. There are at least a half a dozen newspapers that serve this neighborhood, known as Petit Canada, Little Canada. It's sort of bounded by the river and the what's called the Northern Canal. And it's hard, if you're not from the area, you don't necessarily imagine it, but typically in a place like Manchester or Nashua or whatever as well, there would be generally some particular parts of the community that would be like a Greek neighborhood or a Portuguese
Absolutely.
neighborhood.
Yep.
So just large French Canadian population. Parochial schools. as people came in, they were very wary of going to school with non-Catholics, and as well, the Protestants were very wary of going to school with Catholics.
I'm sure.
And so French Canadians in Lowell faced a considerable amount of discrimination. And so part of the creation of parochial schools built around the large French Canadian parishes in the city are in some way a methodology to hold on to culture and language. And they're also, to some extent, a reaction to the fact that people aren't necessarily welcoming the French Canadian population into Lowell initially with open arms.
Sure.
So people become, and this happens with other groups as well over time, but definitely happens to French Canadians. So they create a very sort of an insular kind of they look kind of inward in terms of the population. They also build their own hospital, and they recruit into Lowell an order of nuns from Canada called the Grey Nuns. They come in to work as nurses in the hospital and also as teachers in the lower grades and there's a St. Joseph's Hospital, there's a St. Joseph's Parochial School, there's a French Canadian orphanage.
Yeah.
There's a whole set of institutions. And along with that, there are somewhere between, again, depending on the time period, there are 200 or more small businesses in this neighborhood. So there are, the likely suspects, bakeries,
yeah, right,
delicatessens, places to get beans, places to get meat pies, all the sort of stuff of home, right? And so there's a significant sort of transactional economy inside the neighborhood, which is really very vibrant, even to the point where the neighborhood's taken down. These businesses are still thriving. And in the oral histories, just to sort of get the idea, there are a lot of the oral histories that are done when the national park comes into Lowell. They do a lot of oral histories in the 1970s. So it's pretty long into the 20th century. A lot of people that they interview only speak French.
Yeah.
And because they came as young people, and they lived in this community where they had their newspaper. They also had radio and music and all kinds of entertainment, all sorts of drinking clubs and social clubs and, sports teams and whatever. And so you could live your whole day speaking French, thinking French. And if you went to work in the mills that were in the neighborhoods around right in the area where this Petit Canada was, there were several big mill complexes, the Merrimack Mill Complex, the Lawrence Mill Complex. And these were within a 2 or 3 block walk from anywhere in these neighborhoods. And so that's typically what people did. They settled into these spaces and then could easily walk back and forth to work. And if you got a job in one of these mills, you would be trained by somebody else who spoke French. And so the whole sort of transactional process was fairly easy. Obviously, second generation, more English is spoken. Kids are not going to, some kids are staying in parochial school in high school, other kids are going to Lowell High. And then eventually, by third generation, by sort of the grandchildren of the sort of the pioneers who came early.
Sure.
They're even by that point losing their French entirely, as they're out and about more into the larger city. But it's really quite interesting when you go, even people that are interviewed second generation, they will talk about their parents not speaking English, or maybe one person did and one person didn't. And usually it would be the grandmother that did not speak English because they were more sort of located in the household or whatever. It was or if they worked, they might work in the mill, but they would be working, because many of them did, but they would be working with other French-speaking women. And so they could, again, whatever, right? And the triple deckers, another way to think about the neighborhoods, the 3-deckers that were sort of all over the place, probably up where you are as well.
Yep.
A lot of them haven't survived, but a lot of them were where the stores were. So the ground floor could be a bakery or some kind of a vegetable market or a meat market or whatever it might be. And then the second and third floors, that's where families would live. And that could be generational. So you could have your grandma and your grandpa living in the middle floor, and you and your kids on the top floor. But when you went out to work, you dropped kids off at grandma when you went to work, right? So you had building daycare, and that's pretty typical.
No, that's all. Something I honestly didn't know until I started this project. It seems to be very similar to what's happening in Lowell. That my great grandmother, born, lived her entire life, died in Manchester, never spoke a word of English because you didn't have to. Well, as you just said, you didn't have to for the day to day.
That fits, right? I mean, there's not. I mean, I'm looking down at my notes. There was something called the Pawtucketville Social Club. There were again all of these places, right, where you could. And the same thing happened within other groups when the Greeks came or the Portuguese came to Lowell, but their communities were not as large. The French Canadian community in other than the Irish community, the French Canadian immigrant population they were the second largest, and so they definitely had an influence on the culture of the city. It took quite a while for people to actually begin to make it into politics, like to get elected for city council and things like that. I mean, getting over those humps. The Irish controlled the politics of the city, controlled the patronage of the city, police, fire.
Gotcha. Churches?
Teachers. No, well, churches were, so there were Irish Catholic churches, but there were also French Catholic churches.
Gotcha.
And
each with their own schools, I assume. Yeah.
And they had their own schools, right? So you could go to St. Patrick's. And go to their parochial school, or in the neighborhood I'm in, there's St. Michael's, which is right around the corner from where I live in Centerville. It was a Polish parish, and it also had its own school. And the neighborhood around where I live was not all Polish, but there was a sizable Polish population. So if you go to another part of Lowell, which was Portuguese, and there would be a Portuguese Catholic parish. Generally a K through 8.
Yep.
Would be what a lot of people would do, but then high school would be a little bit harder. It'd be harder for some of the communities to be able to afford high school with everything that would go with it in terms of what kids could get with science and other things, and sports and all the other kind of stuff that by that point, by the 1940s, 1950s, kids want those things. They don't want to, they don't, I mean, probably in Manchester, I know in Lowell, there's Lowell Catholic High School. So there's probably a sizable Catholic high school around where you are that has probably has a really good hockey team.
They did a couple of years. That my alma mater just lost the state championship a couple of years ago. In fact, yes.
Yeah, and that's again, that's fairly, like there's a certain story you can tell. You can adapt it to, like everything I'm saying, you're thinking, oh yeah, that's like down the road.
Correct. Yeah, no, it's awesome.
So it's really. I mean, it's a frustrating thing about teaching immigration history and seeing how difficult some people have it to understand another group and what another group faces when they come in. And unless you can talk to them like we're talking now, and then you say, oh yeah, that was kind of like the way my grandparents would treat it. I don't necessarily, why do I want to do that to somebody else?
Absolutely.
Like they didn't like it. Why do I want to do it to somebody else, right?
Absolutely.
There are certain threads in terms of why people leave home. Nobody leaves home just for the fun of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. People aren't coming down here in the numbers that they are from these parts of Canada where generationally they live. Just for the heck of it, right? They're coming for very specific reasons, mostly economic, as far as people coming from the north are concerned. And again, it's not a lot different than why people are coming, from the Dominican Republic now, or, from Mexico, or from,
absolutely,
some other place, right? And so we have I feel like doing this kind of work is important because if I can get people to at least listen, maybe the story I'm telling about their particular group, I just did a really massive project in Lowell as well, a Greek immigration history for the Hellenic Society, which is the largest Greek cultural organization in Lowell, trying to reveal the same thing, right? And the parallels are really, there's differences, but the parallels are really fascinating.
No, that's great. Now, when did we start seeing a decline then of this? First of all, why? Why did people stop showing up? When did we, I guess, from what I understand, there's almost like an end date that's given to the Petit Canada Lowell.
There's like a shelf life. By the 1920s, the U.S. really, in terms of politics in the United States, from the end of the First World War, from 1918, 1919, till 1925, there's a real effort on the part of a lot of people in Congress from both the Democrat and the Republican parties to stop immigration into the country. A very sort of intense sort of drive to close off immigration, and largely to close it off to Southern and Eastern Europe, and to create quota systems and visas and all sorts of things to regulate people coming in. This also affects people coming in from various parts of Canada, from Quebec, again, from the Maritimes,
Sure.
from New Brunswick, from Nova Scotia, from wherever people would want to be coming in from. And so there's a lot more regulation, and there are numbers set. Only so many people per year can come in from Canada or from Italy or from, and so that all gets enforced starting in 1925. Numbers sort of drop precipitously from most of the world in 1925.
Gotcha.
And the quota system stays in place until the 1960s.
Wow.
So that, coupled with the Great Depression, the stock market crash in 1929, and then the bottom falling out of the American economy, the most compelling reason to come is work.
Yeah,
There
right.
isn't any work, right?
Yeah.
There isn't any work anywhere, right? I mean, the Great Depression is a global Great Depression.
Absolutely.
But the compelling reason for people to leave Montreal or leave Quebec City or leave wherever, or leave Halifax or whatever, is no longer here. So that slows numbers down. Then in the aftermath of the Second World War, there's a period of, say, from the late 1940s to 1960, is a period of time when almost all the large textile mills in New England close up and move south.
Yeah.
So the Amoskeag mill in Manchester, other mills in other parts of Maine, paper mills and such in Holyoke or in Pittsfield, or way out in North Adams, Mass, which has a really large French Canadian population, Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River, and New Bedford. Basically, the textile industry, for all general purposes, disappears.
Gotcha.
So what's now happening to this little Canada, where the majority of people made a living working in these mills, are now finding it difficult to get a job, the neighborhood begins to suffer. There's disinvestment in the mills, there's no work. Maybe in order to engage in some level of upward economic mobility, my grandfather, if again I had come from Quebec, is in Lowell, and he basically makes enough money that he can put a down payment down on a 3-decker in a store.
Gotcha.
But now nobody's working, nobody's buying his pastries or his meat pies,
Right.
or whatever, and okay, or his beans. All right, well, I got to close the store, or I can't invest in keeping the building up, right? And so the neighborhood, an expression, right? There goes the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of the economy shrinking, people being unable to make a living. So lots of people move away to follow the work south. Other people might even go back to Canada if they still have family that they can go back to, or they might move to some other part of the country where it looks like there's work. And the city decides, the Lowell Redevelopment Authority and the Lowell City Council decide that the area where Little Canada sits would make a nice industrial park. And so they basically push through the Lowell City Council the taking of the buildings.
Wow.
And sort of the eviction of the people living in the buildings.
Wow.
And they in this process, they physically knock the buildings down and then light the rubble on fire. They basically burn the neighborhood, street by street. And they tell people, when the decision is made to do it, they tell the people still in the neighborhood that they'll build other housing elsewhere in the city so that people can relocate. But they really don't. They don't come through. They build some, but nothing of consequence that can really absorb all these people. So people will end up moving. People move to Methuen, Chelmsford, Dracut, if they can afford it. But the neighborhood basically disperses. And so by the mid 1960s, late 1960s, that whole neighborhood we were describing a bit earlier is completely gone.
Wow.
It's just like a flat piece of land,
That's
empty
crazy.
of everything. The
Yep.
canal is there on one sort of bounding it on one side, and the river is there kind of bounding it on the other side, but in between,
Wow.
like a desert, right? It's just gone. And the thinking was, which sort of makes sense, but doesn't, but the thinking was, the argument was, this is the point where there's this high-tech miracle in Massachusetts. This is when you get a lot of the first wave of computer companies,
Okay.
Apollo and
Sure.
Digital and all these other companies that are sort of growing, Prime Computer, they're all bubbling up. And the thinking is that it's going to get too expensive to keep manufacturing of the computers and the components and things that are being done in Greater Boston there, because it's much more expensive.
Sure.
And that if we clear this land, all these people will come and build this industrial park
Oh, wow.
on this cleared away land, right? And so the argument is, that if Lowell is going to move forward economically, it has to make this sort of very sharp break with its historical past of the mills, right?
Wow.
And so not only do they tear the neighborhood down, but they start knocking mill buildings down as well.
Sure.
So the big Merrimack Mill Complex, where the Songus Arena is now, where like UMass Lowell plays hockey and such, and there are concerts and all of that. That whole area where the arena sits was where the Merrimack Mills was, which is right in the middle of what had been Little Canada. And so the mills get torn down, and again, this whole area gets cleared, but no investment comes. There is nobody interested in this land.
Sure.
And so by the mid 70s, the university, which is sitting on the other side of the river, and can look across the river and see this vast emptiness. Right. Starts thinking, well, maybe what if we start building some dorms over there, and we start sort of changing the features of what's called Lowell Textile Institute at the time, and have more like campus students, less of a commuter school, some combination thereof, where we build more dormitories and all this other stuff. And so they grow into the space.
Gotcha.
And so that's how they end up there. And then ultimately, as the neighborhood dissipates and as the French Canadian population gets smaller and smaller as well, St. Joseph's Hospital closes as well. And that's sitting right there, right in where the university is. And so eventually the university buys the hospital. The hospital is closed.
Sure.
It buys the building. It tears down the oldest part and builds something that's there now called University Crossing. Keeps about half of what had been the hospital, but puts a new front on it,
Sure.
which sort of faces at the bridge sort of toward where the main campus of the university is. And so the university is pretty much sprawled
Gotcha.
into this space. And if you look at a photograph of it now, I had a student do not time lapse photography, but somebody had taken in the 1940s a series of photographs of Little Canada from an airplane. So you can really see the heft of the neighborhood, how densely packed it is, everything about it. And then she got a friend of hers who's an engineering student to fly a drone and take
awesome.
from the same vantage point, take the same photos. And for her honors college thesis, she like juxtaposed the photos to show, and then wrote about what happened.
That's
And
amazing.
how if you looked at it, you could see what had happened to the neighborhood. It's really quite brilliant. But
is there a way we can find that?
I can send you a link to it.
Sure. Yeah, we'll make that available. Absolutely. That sounds really fascinating. I know that area a little bit only because I used to coach women's rugby at New England College, so I've coached a couple of times down against UMass Lowell in that area. So.
Well, around the back where probably the fields that you would have played on are behind North Campus. And so that area would have been, so from where you were, if you looked across the river, that was where Little Canada would have been, right on the other side of the river. I have a good friend of mine, Paul Marion, who used to work at the university. His uncle owned Marion's Market, which was in the middle of the neighborhood, and he lived on the other side of the river. And in the winter, rather than walk all the way around, he would walk over the river when it froze.
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Over to that neighborhood behind where those playing fields are. People
That's
would just
cool.
go walk across the river. I think it was colder then. I think global warming makes that a bit more
I would
risky.
think so. I don't think I'm going walking in any rivers anytime soon. No.
Right, but he's told me stories about
That's
his
awesome.
uncle and Marion's Market, which was like right in the area that got knocked down.
That's cool. Now, so we've talked about this project a couple times. What was the project? What made you decide to have the format you took with this project?
The thing that's interesting about the city is because there's a national park, and some of the land that we wanted to potentially put signage on is owned by the park.
Sure.
And a lot of the other land is owned by the university. We had to get the park to agree. We also had to get the Lowell Historic Board to agree because they're very sort of into, and rightly so, how the public history gets told. Signage, they don't want stuff willy-nilly and whatever.
Of course.
All just
sure.
Weird shaped signs and whatever, right? So it ended up being a collaboration between the university, the national park, the Lowell National Historical Park, and the Lowell Historic Board. Basically, myself and colleagues at the university from university development and facilities, me and students did research on the neighborhood. And we picked out a bunch of sites, more than 4, but we picked out a lot of sites where we thought signage could go. And then eventually, because it's fairly expensive to do this kind of stuff, make the signs, make them weatherized,
Sure, absolutely,
make them stand up to the elements and all of that. It's not cheap to do, and the signs themselves are pretty good size. We had money at the time to do 4. So we put one at an overlook that looks over the Merrimack River, right across from where the university crossing building is, I mentioned before, where St. Joseph's Hospital used to be, sort of like one of these anchor spots in what had been Little Canada.
Sure.
And it's an overall sign that talks about what used to be there. Sort of if you could glance back in history and you were looking this way in the view, this is what would be here. And then there's 3 more at different places strategically in where the neighborhood had been that tell different stories about the history of the neighborhood. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the writing, the wording. We approached people who are still active in the French Canadian community in the city and had them look at the text and make sure we weren't making any horrendous mistakes. Once these signs were up, they were going to be up. And then we then had to pick out images. So each one of the signs has several images on it as well that show the neighborhood either in a before or after state.
Gotcha.
Which is really fun to do, to pick out the images and try to get them. One of them has a map of like the area where the neighborhood was back in the day. And one's at the entryway to where people would go to the Lasher Park to baseball games.
Yep.
There's a lot of foot traffic. And you sort of got a captive audience waiting there to buy a ticket or whatever. And there's this historic marker. And so hopefully people will read it. That wouldn't necessarily go to a history site or whatever, but it's like right there. So, oh, okay. This is what used to be here. This is what this neighborhood used to be. And another one sort of across from where the University Rec Center is, in a really large area that the university has turned into soccer fields and tennis court. They actually play rugby on.
Yeah, that's where I coached. Yep.
Okay, well, there's right there where the entryway is to that park now, where you go through those big wrought iron sort of fences that are there, that little pavilion area. There's a really large sign right there.
Oh, that's awesome.
Talking about what used to be in that part of the neighborhood. And so, yeah, and if you're there and you look across, you're looking at the old, the old large, really big French Canadian church right there as well. So that's really at the heart of what had been the neighborhood, where that sign is. Yeah, the idea was, again, to work with the park. So the signs are very much like the other signs that the national park has put in different parts of the city as well. So there's a certain level of conformity to it. It was really funny because we put everything up in October. We did all these walks in the summertime with our masks on and everything to be COVID safe and all that. with the park and the historic board and the university picking out the places, and then
Sure.
we all agreed on the text, the images. Then when they were up, we did a little walking tour, mini kind of walking tour to all the signs to see them all up and whatever, which was really fascinating. And then the very first sign, the one right across from where St. Joseph's was, when I was doing the work, I put on a social media site that I have that we were working on in this. And if anybody had any family photos and they didn't mind sharing them, I wouldn't keep them, but I would scan them and give them
Right.
back or whatever. Or you could do a really good JPEG and send it to me. Maybe we could use them. And so elsewhere, I've used these photos in a immigration history website that I have. But one photo got sent from this family that lived in the neighborhood, the Gallaudet family. And they lived on a street that was one of the streets being taken down. But there's a photograph they sent me of the 5 sisters in this family on Easter Sunday with their pastel
Nice
on and whatever. So
Sure.
they're standing all together. It's a really wonderful, really truly wonderful photograph. And so we used it. And then when the signs went up, I was going to email back the family, and I asked them ahead of time, could we use it?
Sure.
I didn't want to
Yep.
put it up there and have them say no. They said sure. Then I wanted to let them know the sign was up, so I was going to email them. But before I could, the 5 sisters have a brother. The brother was just taking a random walk, and he saw the sign. And he went over and looked at the sign and said, "Holy crap, those are my sisters."
That is awesome.
And called the sisters to come look at the sign. And so then they sent me a photo of the
That's great.
youngest of the sisters in the picture, sort of pointing at herself in the sign, which was really, really quite brilliant. And then we had another photo that we used that shows this block of tenements along the canal. And I posted that photo on social media and says, anybody know anything about these buildings or whatever? And this woman sent me an email and said, I grew up in the 3rd building down in this photo along the canal. And my brother and his friends used to dive off the roof of the building into the canal. And they thought, whoa, really brilliant story. And so we used that photograph on one of the other signs.
That's awesome.
And so it's really like people are into the history if you can figure out a way, well, from what you're doing. And so for me, that's like the gold, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You put that out in the world and you have no idea what's going to happen. But then when somebody says, oh yeah, this is a photo of my family on Easter Sunday. And I mean, growing up, my mom I had 3 sisters, and she would make the Easter outfits. And they
believe
were,
it.
Pink and light blue, and whatever,
Oh yeah.
and light green. And my sisters hated it, but that's what you wore. And a matching dress, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's what you did. And so, yeah, the photo I have of the, one of the very young women in the original photo, like pointing at it, it's just like, again, for somebody that does this kind of work and does what I like to do, it was like, oh man, this can't get any better than this.
No, that's awesome. That's way, way fun. Now, this entire conversation has been a blast. So if somebody wants to find these panels, is there an easy way there's like a map available where you can tell them where to go?
There's not a map available yet. There's going to be, but because of COVID, we couldn't do all the things that we had wanted
Sure.
to do. We actually were going to try to put like barcodes on them.
Oh,
so
cool.
people could
Yep.
narrate from each one. But I mean, the easiest way, if you go to the very first one, on that one, it tells you where all the other ones are.
Gotcha.
So the first one is, there on University Avenue, there's what's called the Richard Howe Bridge, which is the major bridge over the Merrimack by the North Campus of UMass Lowell. And that's, again, right across the street from University Crossing. So if somebody wanted to come and look, if you didn't know anything about Lowell,
Right.
you basically search University Crossing, UMass Lowell. That will get you to the spot where right diagonally across the street is the first marker. There's a big area that the university has sort of made into like an overlook looking over the river.
Sure.
The very first large sign is right there. You can't miss it if you get there. And then that one tells you where the other 3 are.
Awesome.
That's
Oh,
the only way to do it for now.
Gotcha. Well, we can. I'll talk to Mike, see if we can put up a map at least to the first one, so we can attach that on our social media. Because this sounds awesome. I definitely want to go down and check it out.
Yeah, if you do, like I say, if you do University Crossing, whatever, or it's sort of at the corner of the Pawtucket Street and University Avenue. I think that's sort of if you're doing the geocode or whatever. My students know that I don't. Then that would be the way. And like I say, there's one by LeLacheur Park.
Yeah.
So that's an easy enough marker for people that that's an obvious one. And then there's the other one by those playing fields where you said you were coaching rugby.
Yep. No.
Where the skates are now, that's where the fourth one is. So the second one is on the bridge over the canal.
Yep.
And that's the one with the photo of the tenement blocks.
Gotcha.
Where the
jumping off.
Brother and his friends used to dive off. I can't imagine it. So they're pretty easy to find.
Awesome. Well, this has been fun. Thank you so much. Again, we've been talking to Dr. Forrant about a really awesome project, putting up all kinds of interesting panels around the city of Lowell, telling the French-Canadian history of that super important town to our story. So thank you very much for joining us, sir.
My pleasure.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.